Okay, let's get started. How you guys holding up? Pretty good? Enjoy yourself this week? Yeah? What'd you like the best? Anything in particular?
Thornton.
The moderator. Anything you'd like to see more of?
Moderation. Free books.
It's tough being a moderator at such an immoderate kind of conference.
I like to see the debates. I mean, if people don't know that,
Yeah, that's interesting you say that, because I was just discussing that with Professor Salerno this week, that it might be nice to have a debate between professors on a particular issue like IP or something like that, you know? Put David Gordon up against Walter Block and have at it. I'd like to moderate something like that. Okay, our task here today is to look at prediction and business cycles. One of the most difficult of all things to do is to predict the course of the business cycle itself, or just prediction in general. And so what we're going to do here today is, the most important thing is to look at the difference between the way Austrians view prediction and the way the mainstream views prediction. Now, of course, if the business cycle were in a textbook sense, where you have GDP and time, if it oscillated in a pattern like that every time, it would be pretty easy to predict. And also, we wouldn't have as much to worry about in terms of the cycle. But in the real world, the business cycle is very difficult to measure, very difficult to get your hands on exactly where we would be in any particular business cycle, and certainly it is to predict the future path. So you might get something like that. Whereas in this case, you could just plot the trend out. But in this case, if you were establishing economic policies or making investments, or you're an entrepreneur deciding whether to expand or contract your business, if you use that trend analysis, you'd be in deep, serious trouble. Now, a couple things that for your future development in terms of prediction, and if you wanted to go to some of the sources, let's see, get Mises up there, The Ultimate Foundation of Economic Science, an essay on method. So you'd want to begin there, and we're going to cover some of the material in this book. And then the next step would be to take a look at Mises on the manipulation of money and credit. And this is a compilation of a lot of Mises' writings on money and credit, in particular how they affect the business cycle. And within this book, is actually a 1928 book called The Causes of the Economic Crisis. So you get this in this book. But this is the most important section of it with respect to what we're going to be doing in here today. Okay, so let's take a look at the mainstream first in terms of how they view it. And this is pretty tricky. A lot of it depends upon what you mean by the word prediction. Okay, so for mainstream economists, prediction is the goal. That's why they do what they do. The ultimate goal for them in terms of what economics does for us is it creates predictions about the future. This is sort of the holy grail of science. In the natural sciences, astronomy in particular, being able to predict events in the future is really what makes you famous. So you're a superstar. Your name goes down in history for what you've been able to predict using the tools of the natural sciences. So with Halley's Comet, for example, Edmund Halley predicted that this comet would return 76 years in advance, and sure enough, when the comet came back, everybody was completely astounded. They named the comet after him, and his name becomes immortal in a sense. So that's where the social scientist and the economist, there's this envy of the natural sciences. They would like to reproduce what the natural sciences have been able to do in terms of measuring phenomenon, testing the phenomenon, using laboratory experiments to identify and define whatever they're looking at, and to be able to predict the future in terms of chemical interactions or comets revolving around the solar system. So prediction is the goal. In order to get to prediction, mainstream economists are willing to entertain and use unrealistic assumptions in their models. Okay, so when you see mainstream analysis and you get to points in their argumentation and they're using such unrealistic assumptions about the real world, much of which has been pointed out to you during the week, that's perfectly fine with them. It's perfectly fine to use homo economicus, simplified models, unrealistic assumptions, as long as they produce better predictions about the future. So the justification for all of these unrealistic assumptions and models is that they allow for better predictions. In mainstream economics, success is defined by predictions. Okay, if your predictions are correct, if your model produces the proper results over and over again, that is success. Okay, you get published, you get book contracts, and you rise in success within the profession. And over time, progress within economics is defined by better predictions over time. As a matter of fact, the motto of the Econometric Society, which is sort of the top edge of the profession, their motto is "Science is prediction." Okay, so that's their focus. That's they're willing to use unrealistic assumptions. It's a determinant of success, and it's a determinant of progress. So they really put a lot of weight on prediction. Now, for the Austrians' part, we reject forecasting altogether in favor of qualitative predictions. And I'm going to talk about and define all of these things for you. The reason that we cannot predict the way Edmund Halley was able to predict the return of that comet is that there are no constant relations with human action. Sure, we have certain physical properties to us like rocks and so forth, like chemicals, but our driving motivation is not subject to constant relations. Okay? Man is free to act, man is free to choose, and to change his mind. In fact, Mises says that men are not rocks, to try to drive home this point. Rocks have a regularity to them. They have physical properties. You can determine the chemical composition of various types of rocks. Now, we do have praxeological predictions that we can make with certainty. Okay, so that if we pass a law that requires an effective minimum wage of in today's terms, let's say $100 an hour, we can be certain that if all other things are held constant, that that's going to cause a great deal of unemployment. As a matter of fact, let me see if I can find this. I'll read you what Mises has to say about this, about economic prediction. Quote, economics can predict the effects to be expected from resorting to definite measures of economic policies. It can answer the question whether a definitive policy is able to attain its ends aimed at, and, if the answer is in the negative, what its real effects will be. But of course, this prediction can only be qualitative. It cannot be quantitative, as there are no constant relations between the factors and the effects concerned. The practical value of economics is to be seen in this neatly circumscribed power of predicting the outcome of definitive measures. Okay, so that's the idea behind praxeological prediction. So we can make qualitative predictions. We can use theory to understand the past and to understand, in some sense, the future. And this is the only appropriate method for the use of economic theory in, quote-unquote, predicting the future. Now, this is unsatisfactory to many people. We'd love to have the ability to see the future, but it's just not in human nature. Now, there's a tension that I'm going to try to develop here about prediction within the Austrian school. In one sense, prediction is impossible, but in another sense, we do engage in various types of prediction. Mises finds that forecasting as a science is self-contradictory. For example, if I forecast a flat stock market for 6 months and then a stock market crash 6 months from now, and I make this prediction in the sense that I actually foresee the future. I have the ability to foresee the future with certainty that we're going to have a flat stock market for 6 months and then a crash. If this was actually scientifically valid, and it was such a big deal that, of course, I made all the newspapers, all the television stations, I was on Fox News, I was on the Glenn Beck show, became very famous that I had this ability, what would happen?
Entrepreneurs would adjust their expectations to compensate for your prediction?
Yes. There would be reactions to my prediction. And what types of entrepreneurial or just regular actions would people do?
Speculators would short the market, investors would sell, then the assumption would happen to do it a month early, then they'd say, it's a month early, not we'll do it 3 months early, and it would happen immediately.
Yes. The people would start the idea of selling their stocks, shorting the market. This guy's got a big smile on his face because he used to be in stock market analysis, and the idea of having somebody that could actually predict the future with certainty is just mouth-watering. But what would happen is that people would adjust their expectations, and instead of the stock market crashing 6 months from now, it would get pushed up, and so the market would start crashing right now when I first made the prediction. So if my predictions were actually valid, people would sell early, and the bust would in the stock market would occur prior to my target, and my forecast would actually be wrong. So there's an inherent contradiction in the idea of prediction and human action being scientific in the sense that I actually see the future. It's not just a good guess about the future. So we might want to think in terms of predictions as being from the natural sciences, the physical sciences, where we can say with almost complete certainty that we know the future. That I know that if I put a little baking powder in a dish and a little vinegar, it's going to foam up. And we can do that over and over again 1,000,000 times, and we can be certain that every time we do it, if we do it correctly, that same action is going to take place. Forecasts, on the other hand, we might want to lump into a category where we're taking our best available knowledge with regards to the present and the course of economic policy, and we make an educated guess about the future. So the distinctions come down to the following. In the mainstream of economic analysis, there's a very heavy emphasis on empirical research and on empirical aspects of economic phenomenon. Second, prediction is the key. It's a measure of success and it's a measure of progress, and everything can be bent in the direction of making better predictions about the future. The Austrians, on the other hand, put theory above all else. So there's a primacy to economic theory. There's a primacy of theory establishing cause and effect in a realistic way for us. And theory, for the Austrians, is then used as a tool to help us understand. It can help us understand in the sense that using economic theory we can understand the past, and it also gives us some insight into the future. For the Austrians, man is not a rock. For the mainstream, in some sense, man is a rock. Homo economicus is an assumption that applies to everybody for the mainstream. It's just sort of general notion of what people are as a homogeneous sort of blob. And if man is a homogeneous blob, then they seem to think that they can go on with their program. Now, one of the interesting things in the history of the Austrian schools was that despite this dramatic difference between the Austrians and the mainstream, we find that in the 1920s, Ludwig von Mises himself is working to establish an institute in Vienna within the Chamber of Commerce, where he worked, to mimic the methods that were being employed by the National Bureau of Economic Research to do exactly what he was arguing against, which is the collection of economic data in order to produce information about the business cycle itself. So Mises was trying to set up what actually came to be known as the Austrian Institute for Business Cycle Research. Friedrich von Hayek was going to be the first director of this institute. And Hayek also expressed the same sort of views, the methodological views, about the role of statistics and the primacy of economic theory. He had just published his dissertation in 1929 where he lays all this out. And so what is the first thing he does? Is become director of a statistical institute. In 1923 and 1924, he was in the United States learning what the Americans were doing in terms of this empirical research. And so he was was qualified, or as qualified as anybody in Austria, to conduct this type of research. He was very skeptical. He expressed this skepticism in his correspondence, knowing full well that the statistical work that he was undertaking could not contribute to improving economic theory. So the question is, how did he reconcile all this? Well, he might have just needed the money, basically. He'd just gotten his PhD and he basically needed a job. And in his correspondence, he said he wished he could use this money to extend his theoretical contributions, but was tied down in terms of this empirical research. The stated goal of the Austrian Institute for Business Cycle Research was to improve information for better decision-making in firms. And so the Institute has started adopting the research methods from Harvard and the National Bureau of Economic Research, even though the two main players in the Institute were deeply skeptical of this approach. They both viewed the study of cycles with statistical methods without the use of theory is just simply a form of self-deception. Hayek recommended in his work related to this institute that any kind of prediction that the institute would make should be made with a great deal of modesty. It should be hedged with qualifiers with respect to economic theory. This is a brand new article on the subject. I'll quote to you. Hayek did not exclude the logical possibility of predicting the business cycle, but rested his skepticism again on the fact that presently such forecasts are attempted in too unconditional a form and on an inadmissibly oversimplified basis. Yet he stated quite apodictically that the statistical research in this field is meaningless except insofar as it leads to a forecast. However, much of that forecast may have to be hedged about with qualifications. So this work that Hayek is conducting is sort of tearing at his methodological foundations. The second director of this institute was Oscar Morgenstern, who was also an Austrian economist, but he tended to side with Mises in the sense that he felt that prediction was an impossible in the human sciences. What Hayek did in the early years of this institute was use what's called the Harvard barometers. Today they're called the leading indicators, the coincidental indicators, and the lagging indicators. So these are statistical series that are studied statistically against the overall economy to determine which things in an economy lead the business cycle, which are coincidental or occurring as the business cycle does, and then the lagging indicators lag the business cycle. So that things like new installations of telephone lines were considered a leading indicator because it meant more houses were being built, more office space was opening up, people would be then moving in, buying furniture, getting jobs, and so forth. So they line up all these statistics in order to get an idea of where we are in the business cycle. And not oddly enough, but at the time, Mises and Hayek viewed the Harvard barometers as based on theory. Specifically, they felt that these barometers were based on the Austrian theory of the business cycle. So that you have the barometers as sort of a middle ground between the Austrians and the Austrian theory of the business cycle and the German historical school, or what was then the remnant of the German historical school. There was an institute in Berlin, Germany, that was doing statistical work trying to measure and predict the business cycle. But like the historical school, they assumed that there was no economic theory and that economic theory was invalid and it wasn't very useful. So these, in Berlin, they were just simply collecting any kind of statistical series that they could get their hands on and using their own discretion in terms of assigning importance with respect to predicting the economic cycle. And then you have in Vienna the Austrians and their emphasis on theory, and Mises and Hayek felt that the Harvard barometers were some sort of middle ground, some sort of practical, applied way of using their theory to help inform businesses and economic policy. In fact, at one point Mises claimed that, quote, the Harvard barometer does provide the statistical verification of the circulation credit theory. Okay, now, elsewhere, he's actually very harsh on these types of statistical tools. So, instead of prediction in the natural science sense, Mises and Hayek looked at, in Mises' case, praxeological prediction, and Hayek developed his view where you could make pattern predictions. Okay, so Mises was using, if you increase the minimum wage, ceteris paribus, you're going to get more unemployment. So there's a certainty of that type of prediction. In the same way that the natural sciences can produce certain predictions. Hayek, especially later on in his career, developed this notion of pattern predictions, where you do not have concrete forecasts of the future or a future event with respect to time and place. But you can make pattern predictions so that, for example, if you say that the central bank has been increasing the money supply at a much faster rate than it has in the past, then we should expect greater price inflation at some point in the future. So this is just a general pattern type of prediction. So there's a big difference between mainstream economics and their views on the business cycle and Austrian economics. And within the Austrian school, there's sort of a nuance of difference in the sense that Austrians believe that you can't make predictions of the future. You can make the praxeological predictions, and Hayek believes that you can also make pattern predictions, which are essentially the same thing as a forecast where you realize that the potential for error. So now let's jump to the present, the current cycle. Now, the big thing with the current cycle today is, of course, why we haven't had a rebound, why the economy has not recovered. Why does Ben Bernanke have to go in front of the television camera every month and say that he sees signs of recovery? That there are green shoots I'm starting to wonder what these green shoots are. I originally thought he was referring to grass coming up in the springtime, but I'm not sure. Maybe it's a different type of grass that they're working on at the Fed. Well, let's take a look at their problem. The stock market peaked in the fall of 2007. It bottomed in March of 2009. And the stock market has recovered a great deal. However, if we look at unemployment, the real economy, we find that in the fall of 2007, the unemployment rate was less than 5%, which is a really low level. By March of 2009, when the stock market bottomed, the unemployment rate in the United States was 9.5%. And while the stock market has recovered a great deal of its losses since then, the unemployment rate is still 9.5%. And if we look at GDP as another kind of indicator, we see that the GDP, which peaked in early of 2008, and then, of course, began to flatten out and then decline in 2009. And then today, it's recovered a little bit, but it has not even recovered as much as the amount of money that they've spent on the stimulus and the bailouts and all that kind of stuff. So you'd think that if you had what the economy already had and you added all of this spending, that would naturally just lift up that GDP number. It has lifted it a little bit, but not very much. So, from the mainstream point of view, what they do is they look back at past cycles. And what they find is that in past cycles, a lot of them show that there's a sharp decline in the economy and then a sharp recovery. The so-called V-shaped recovery, where you go into a decline, you hit a hard bottom, and then the economy recovers fairly quickly. There's usually a little stimulus spending, maybe a few bailouts involved, but you get that quick recovery and the recession is forgotten. So why hasn't that happened this time? After all, the stimulus was massive, the bailouts were unprecedented, so you'd think that not only would you get a sharp recovery, but a very sharp recovery based on these historical studies where you've looked at all the past recessions, you've looked at the past stimulus packages, and you get these V-shaped recoveries. So Bernanke and the White House economists, they're getting kind of sick and tired of having very little to say about the recovery. It appears imminent. It seems to be moving along. It's inevitable. I love that one. It's inevitable. Well, of course, the Austrian perspective is we don't just look at past cycles to determine what's happening in this cycle. We also want to look at things like economic policies. What differences have occurred that might change that historical result? Well, first of all, their view on stimulus spending and bailouts is actually incorrect because it's based on statistical analysis. If you add stimulus spending, if you add bailout spending, if you have huge deficits, they tend to show up in terms of increases in GDP, just because there's more money being spent. Doesn't matter what it's on. But the real effect of stimulus spending and bailouts is actually to undermine productive economic activity because of the diversion of resources and of the impact on prices that such programs have. In a typical correction, all the male investments are liquidated. All the misplaced labor is liquidated. And so what happens is asset prices and labor wage rates decline precipitously to the point where entrepreneurs can start matching it back together again into new firms, into new projects. So the stimulus and the bailouts actually prevent or help prevent that corrective process. So the first thing that they're missing is the real impact of stimulus spending and bailouts. It doesn't help the economy, it actually hurts the corrective process. And so it's basically stymieing and preventing entrepreneurs from engaging in new investments, which is really the key to the recovery. Second of all, the regime has created a great deal of entrepreneurial uncertainty. First of all, there's uncertainty about the economy itself. Where is the economy headed? Everybody's been told that the recovery is imminent for a year and a half. It's not happening, so our leaders don't seem to know what they're doing. I know that's not a big revelation in this room, but for the general population, it's kind of a shock, or at least an uncertainty, that things are not going as planned. Second, there's regulatory uncertainty in banking and finance. They've passed the legislation, but there's a great deal of uncertainty as to how all that's going to pan out. There's a lot of ambiguous elements, things that are going to have to be designed by bureaucracies, for example, and aren't going to be implemented except over a timetable. So there's a great deal of uncertainty in banks and financial institutions about what they can do in the future. So they're very reluctant to make, for example, to make loans because of all the regulations and requirements that may be imposed or that are being imposed on them right now. There's uncertainty with respect to energy policy, the cap and trade legislation, which is sort of looming in Washington. People have been given general outlines about what that legislation is going to look like, but there's no final determination except that it's going to be very expensive. So under those conditions, when energy is, probably the most important physical resource in the economy, we don't really know how much we're going to be able to use and at what price. So the P and Q regarding the most important raw material in our economy is in question. And it's the type of uncertainty where they're going to give us a sort of fixed effect, where they're going to limit the Q with respect to energy. And finally, there's uncertainty with regard to taxes. Of course, the tax structure of the federal government is always up in question with regard to the near-term and far-term future. But, of course, they're actively debating whether or not to repeal the Bush tax cuts. They're actively debating other types of taxes. And, of course, people looking, if you want to look back in history, one of the things you would find is that at the beginning of the Great Depression, there was a massive increase in income tax rates. So if this is a repeat of the past, which I'm hoping it's not, then people looking at tax rates and the current political regime in Washington, D.C., there'd be a lot of fear as well as uncertainty with regard to taxes. So if we combine the impact of the economic downturn and the stimulus and the bailouts, combining that with the uncertainty with respect to financial regulation, with respect to energy, and with respect to taxes, there's a great deal of uncertainty. And so with that type of analysis, we would expect either no recovery or a very slow recovery, or possibly even the situation becoming much worse. But that doesn't go into the White House forecast, and that doesn't apparently go into Mr. Bernanke's forecast of the future. They see, that the recovery must occur based on historical statistical analysis. And this is why they're having such a hard time getting the old money supply revved up. The Fed has been increasing the money supply like it never has in the past. There's been a massive increase in the money supply with respect to what the Fed has control over. It's expanded its balance sheet. It's increased the money supply, so the Fed is adding to the money supply. But the fact that there's so much uncertainty in the economy means that all the other aspects of the money supply, the money creation process, have been stymied. So if we look at banks, if we look at hedge funds, if we look at derivatives and all those higher layers in money and credit, what we find is in all those higher layers have been contracting. And so the Fed has been ineffective. It's got interest rates down to zero. It's been quantitative easing. It's been expanding its balance sheet. And so, again, based on historical studies of the mainstream, they would expect that the money supply would ultimately get larger and stimulate economic activity. It's not happening. It's not happening because of all these other things they've been doing, creating uncertainty, creating fear in the economy, and therefore slowing down or stopping the process of financial firms lending money out and other financial firms investing the money, which would ultimately cause increases in money and credit out there in the economy. So again, their historical statistical approach has failed them. Whereas just simple basic economic analysis like pick up the newspaper, read the newspaper, and then use a little economic theory to figure out, is this pro-economic activity or anti-economic activity? And you'd have your answer. Not at any really high level of theory, but just basic economics. Okay, so what I've been doing, people often wonder, what do you do? I work here at the Institute, and I appear at the Mises University, but other than that, it sounds too good to be true. One of the things I've been doing is looking at all those situations back over the last 100 years where things were too good to be true. And specifically, I've written articles on the Great Depression, the stagflation of the 1970s in the United States, the Japanese bubble during the 1980s, the tech stock bubble, and the housing bubble, this current one. And what I've found is that in terms of predictions, the Austrians have made correct predictions prior to the onset of all those crises, with the exception of the Japanese bubble, because it was because it was in Japan. We don't have any Japanese Austrians, or we, at least at the time we didn't, very few. So during the Great Depression in 1928 and 1929, Mises and Hayek were not making public forecasts about, the stock market's going to tank, but Mises, of course, wrote this book analyzing the type of monetary policy that was being conducted in the United States that was modeled on the work of Irving Fisher. And he basically said that if you follow Fisher's policy advice, you're going to set the economy up for a big crash. He published the book in 1928. And so he didn't make a specific forecast that the stock market was going to crash by 50% in June or October of 1929, but he certainly laid it all out in this book. And of course, books are hard to make disappear if you make the wrong prediction. Hayek also made predictions of the same sort in his dissertation, Monetary Theory of the Trade Cycle, which was done in German and translated and published in 1933. Other Austrians made similar forecasts. Benjamin Anderson was writing about the situation here in the United States. In contrast to that, everybody else thought that the 1920s was a new era. They had a regular prosperity through much of the 1920s. Irving Fisher was the most prominent American economist, and he was regularly quoted in the newspaper. And right before the crash, he said that he foresaw no possibility of a stock market crash, and that the United States economy was now on a permanently high plateau of prosperity. The stock market crashed, and Fisher continued to advise people to put more money into the stock market. He himself invested his own fortune, his wife's fortune, and some of his university's endowment in the stock market. He lost all of his money, all of his wife's money. He lost a lot of money for the endowment. As he continued to recommend, he said that stocks have hit bottom. And then, of course, the next day they would go down another 15%. And he said, I can't imagine stock prices going any lower. They're below the fundamental values. And then the stock market would crash the next day. He thought it was all, he got paranoia as a result of all this. And he was not alone. Politicians, other economists, business leaders thought that this was a new era and that it was going to continue forever. And they completely missed it. The stock market lost 95% of its value from top to bottom. Fast forward to the 1960s. They were called the go-go 1960s. We were fighting the war in Vietnam. We were fighting the Cold War. We were fighting the war on poverty. The economy was rising quarter after quarter. The stock market was rising quarter after quarter. The Keynesian economists had come to Washington. They were using Keynesian macroeconomic stability policies, and they thought that they were creating this new era. And in fact, they were. They were creating a boom and a bubble in the U.S. economy. The economist who was the chairman of the President's Council of Economic Advisors, Arthur Okun, described the U.S. economy as a new era of permanent prosperity. They had eliminated recessions from the economy for almost 9 years that they had been in power. He said that the business cycle was now dead, that we had scientifically stabilized the economy, and that we would no longer even have to study business cycles. Just take it right out of the curriculum. And he published a book on all this in early 1970, 1 month before the economy tanked into a recession. And not only did a recession begin, but it was fairly severe. Nixon imposed comprehensive wage and price controls, took us off the gold standard. Inflation went up, unemployment went up. There was a very erratic behavior in general economic statistics. In the 1970s were characterized as the stagflation, where you had both high inflation and high unemployment, pretty much the entire decade. And then in the early 1980s, there was a mini depression with two recessions, very steep interest rates, high interest rates, and high unemployment rates. Now, right before all this, in 1969, Murray Rothbard published a pamphlet on the causes and cures of the economic cycle. Henry Hazlitt was writing on a weekly basis describing monetary problems, problems with the deficit, problems with overspending, problems with inflation, clearly foreseeing economic troubles ahead. And Ludwig von Mises, in the last interview he ever gave, he didn't make any specific prediction, but he talked about the monetary policy problems of the United States in rather dire terms. So obviously he saw that current economic policy was in trouble and that trouble lied ahead in the U.S. economy. And as I said, there were no Austrians that I could find that predicted the Japanese bubble, but there were a lot of American academics who saw the Japanese situation as really the way to go. And it wasn't just economists. Laura DeAndrea Tyson, who was President Clinton's chairperson of economic advisors, thought that, if we don't follow the Japanese lead on this, we're going to be buried. And everybody was saying pretty much the same thing, that Japan was going to take over the world economically, and that every other country who failed to follow their lead was going to be doomed. One of my colleagues over at Auburn University in the business school wrote an op-ed in 1989, right before the Japanese stock market crashed. It was over 36,000, and now it's down less than 10,000, I think. He said that if we don't follow the Japanese lead, that by 1995, interest rates were going to be 45%, and unemployment would be over 20%. Of course, we didn't see that in 1995, and I still have a copy of that guy's op-ed. And then as we go into the more recent crisis, the tech stock bubble and the housing bubble, it's probably a little more obvious to you that there were numerous Austrian economists who foresaw the tech bubble and saw the looming crash in the stock market in 1998, 1999, and the year 2000. I collected more than a dozen sets of quotations and probably another dozen Austrian economists who made simple predictions during that time period. Whereas the predictions of mainstream economists, Wall Street economists, Federal Reserve economists, and so forth were all incorrect. They were all predicting the wrong thing. They all thought that tech was the thing, that it's going to make the economy a new era. In fact, it was such a new era that one of the big worries of some economists and some management specialists, Newt Gingrich and so forth, was that things were going to get so easy in the future that there would be nothing for us to do. There would be no jobs to keep us preoccupied. So, that the ultimate in utopian thinking was going on at that time. And the same thing for the housing bubble. Numerous Austrians predicted the housing bubble as early as 2003. One guy actually predicted in 1997 that there would be a housing bust in the United States in 2008. Pretty good prediction. And of course, it was a great prediction, but he's not good enough to get a regular academic position. So there were numerous Austrians as early as 2003. I went over some of those predictions in my previous lecture. And of course, Fed economists were saying there's no housing bubble. Greenspan said there was no housing bubble until he left office. He knew there was a housing bubble because he left office just in time to avoid the bust. And then Bernanke, he thought that everything was great. I've got an article, a daily article on Mises.org, what they were saying in 2007. It's actually the Federal Reserve as a con game or confidence game, what they were saying in 2007, where I quote all of the Federal Reserve high officials as to what they thought was happening right before the market turned down. And they thought everything was great, as usual. They didn't see the housing bubble. They saw all these new financial products as the wave of the future, creating more and more prosperity. They completely missed it, or if they did get it, they certainly weren't telling us about it, because they were saying, keep your money in, you don't have any worries. On the outside of the Fed, people were saying housing prices never go down, you can never lose money in real estate, all the typical nonsense that mainstream economics provides for us in some sense. Well, we got a couple of minutes for questions.
I'd like to make a short comment and a question. The comment is that probably a good analyst works as hard as possible understanding the present, not predicting the future. And by understanding the present, knowing what's possible in the future, statistics might form part of that. That would be a means of understanding the present. But having said that, going back to human action and Lisa's comments on entrepreneurs, if you can't predict, what does it entrepreneurs do? Are they just arbitraging current circumstances?
Yeah, what are entrepreneurs doing? Well, they're making, in a sense, a forecast. They're making an investment that's uncertain. So it's in the realm of forecasting in an informal way, an informal forecast. Yeah, one more.
The problem we have as financial practitioners with the Austrian school is that we're seen as perma-bears. There's always kind of saying there's going to be a crisis. If you say there's going to be a crisis in 50 years, sure, there will be a crisis in that year, but do you have any examples where Austrians are optimistic on something?
Yeah, I mean, I think in normal times we just don't say anything. The mainstream economists are really great at trend analysis. As a matter of fact, that Mises refers to it as the trend doctrine, which is like this. If the economy is going like this, these guys are really great at, putting those dots out there. The Austrians tend to, if we don't see a big problem, then we tend not to say anything, because that's not our, producing trend forecasts is not our forte. That's their forte. Our forte is, if you see something getting out of line, there may be a question mark here as to what's going to happen in the future. And the Austrian forecasts do not forecast with respect to the timing of something, when it's going to happen exactly, and the magnitude of the happening or the event. How severe is it going to be as measured in terms of dollars and things, unemployment rates? We don't have any tools that would allow us to say the unemployment rate is going to 12% by December 31st of this year. So with respect to permanent bears, there is the problem of what I've been discussing is the short-term phenomenons, and what I've been looking at is been finding groups of Austrian economists, academic ones and market ones, who are making clusters of predictions right before events happen. There is the perma-bear phenomenon where we're on a paper currency, it's inevitable that it's going to break down, and all hell is going to break loose, and so there's that problem, which is a very long-term problem. We've been on paper money for 40 years and hasn't broken down yet. But yeah, there's perma-bears who are on that cycle, and you just have to ignore them. Okay, thank you very much, and I'll stay here.